Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Yes? Okay, great. So, tonight, guys, or this afternoon, wherever you are, we are going to take a closer look at our ancestry from Metz. About a year ago, when I last presented to you, I talked about our ancestry from Alsace-Lorraine, and we talked about some of the interesting connections. Well, part of our ancestry from Alsace actually originated from this city called Metz. I mentioned it briefly in the presentation a year ago. We're going to do a much deeper dive on this ancestry in this presentation. So this is actually a slide that I put together a year ago, so some of it may be familiar, but this is a background on the history of Metz. So it's the capital of a province of France called Lorraine, which is near Alsace. While the recent history of Jews began in the mid to late 1500s, after France reoccupied the town in 1552, there was an earlier Jewish presence in the town as early as in 888. Probably the most famous person, Rabbeinu Gershom, who was actually born there, and he was famous for issuing takanot, or decrees, that prohibited polygamy in the Ashkenaz lands. So a really key difference when we talk about Metz is that it was an urban city, whereas Alsace, the neighboring region, was pretty rural. And, people like to compare it to other cities in Western Germany, like in Frankfurt or Mainz. There was a prominent Jewish community. I talk about the population here, 3,000 people in the early 1700s, and about 2,000 people right before the French Revolution. There was a Talmudic school, and there was a Hebrew printing press, so it was a flourishing city. Another interesting thing about Metz is that they imported their rabbis from other parts of Europe, and it made the city a bit more cosmopolitan than other areas, where they would import rabbis from Poland, from places further east, and these were pretty famous rabbis that would lead the community. And the reason why they did that is they didn't want any partiality towards any members of the community. They didn't want to have someone from the community be chosen. And one of the interesting things, I mentioned this a year ago, is that one of our ancestors on the Landau side of the family, through our rabbinic family, actually was one of the rabbis of Metz back in the 1660s. Rabbi Yonah Frankel Teomim was very famous. So pretty interesting connection that, the Landau line and the Lehmann line connecting here. And then the last thing here is that the population in Paris really grew during the 1800s, the 19th century. And by World War I, it was much, much larger. The Jewish population was nearing 75,000. But at the time of the French Revolution, there were only 500 Jews in Paris. So, there were more Jews living in Metz than there were living in Paris during the 18th century and before then. So that was the overview of just Metz, and we're going to talk about the city a lot more. But I really wanted to really begin this presentation by talking about how the work that I do and the work that I've done is really a continuation of the work of other members of our family, and in particular, Uncle Rene. He had done a significant amount of research into his Alsace ancestry. He was really connected to his French ancestry. He even visited Alsace-Lorraine, visited the archives in Alsace-Lorraine, and found birth records. He found marriage records and death records of some of our ancestors that he then donated to the Leo Baeck Institute a number of years ago. And so I include a link where you can actually see some of the materials that he sent, but he even included a family tree. And everything that I'm doing here is really, I see as a continuation of Uncle Rene's work. I feel so terrible that he's not able to be here for this presentation, because I know he would have loved this. And in particular, who are we talking about here? So we are talking about Leo Lehmann, who was Uncle Rene and my grandfather Henry's father. Leo's mother, Henriette Frank, she is the one who was from Alsace originally. And we are talking about a specific subset of that. It was Henriette's maternal grandmother, who we're going to be talking about tonight, and her ancestry. Her name was Flora Cohen. And if you look at the far right-hand side of the page, what Uncle Rene had donated, to the Leo Baeck Institute, he knew her name. He actually was able to get that far in his tree, but he was able to go no further. He basically didn't know where her origins were, but that he found her on a marriage record of Flora's daughter. And that was a pretty good amount of progress in the pre-internet age before a lot of these documents were digitized and put online. And for me, it would take a lot of work to figure out where she was from. So if we go to the next page here, what was the initial breakthrough that I had with Flora and researching her? Well, Uncle Rene had actually identified where she lived. She was in this town of Haguenau. I'm not pronouncing it correctly. I apologize in advance for all of the French that I'm going to mispronounce on this presentation. But she was from this town in Alsace. She was living in this town in Alsace in the 19th century. So the first thing I did is I found censuses from the early 19th century that mentioned her name and her husband's name. And all of them were consistent in stating that she was from Metz and she was born in 1784. So fortunately, the city of Metz, this is something we're going to talk about, has very good records. I went through the birth records from 1784, and I came across a name, Blimela Cohen, who was born on the 17th of June. You can actually see this birth record at the bottom of the page here. It mentions that she's the daughter of Simon Surf Cohen and Adel Seligman Wiedersheim. This is really great information because we actually have her parents and her grandfather's names in this little record here. But Blimela is a Yiddish name for flower, and it is equivalent to the French name of Flora. But could they be the same person? There was a lot of clues here, but this was not enough to convince me that this was actually that I had identified the right person. So this took a lot of work. In fact, when I last spoke to you a year ago, I had not found this record. But over the past year, I did. And what did I find? Well, I found Flora's marriage record from 1812. And from 1810, actually. And what's interesting is she was not living in Alsace. She was not living in Metz. She was living in Paris. Remember, I mentioned there were very few Jews in Paris at this time. She was one of them, along with her husband, and they lived there for a few years. In fact, their first son, Edward, was born in Paris. And so what you see here is their marriage record. And I'll just point out here one of the really special moments when you're researching a name. You see her name, Flora Cohen, and it says her alternate name is Blimela Cohen. And it mentions the same parents' names. And again, we have her son, birth record also in Paris, so we know that the family was in Paris during this time. Everything checks out, and I had confirmed the connection to Metz. And this was the initial discovery. I've then found a lot of other things, including her death record and her grave, which are in Alsace, that identified the connections that I had made. And even in the appendix, I found this more recently. I actually found a 1808 naming record. So in 1808, Napoleon ruled that all Jews in Alsace had to adopt a surname. Now, Flora already had her surname of Cohen, but it actually, on this form, it states that she was changing her name from Blimela to Flora. And that was just 2 years prior to this marriage record. So you can check out the appendix where you can actually see that record. It's really cool. It has a lot of her other family members as well, where some of their French names were changed from their maybe Yiddish names. So that was very exciting. I even wanted to include this here as well, this is actually her grave on the left-hand side and her husband's, Samuel Hirsch's, grave on the right. They are still intact. They're in great shape overall. You can actually read the inscriptions very clearly. I've translated them into English. And it's pretty interesting. Both of them include ties to Blimela's father, who was Shimon Cohen, and was pretty famous. He's written on Blimela's grave as the Gadol, and in her husband's grave, it says he's the son-in-law of Rabbi Shimon, who was the president of the rabbinical court of Colma, which we're going to talk about a little bit about who Flora's father was at the very end of the presentation. But not only does Flora and her husband make reference to Flora's father, but even Flora's daughter, who was Leo's maternal grandmother, her grave also makes mention of being the granddaughter of Rav Shimon. So clearly he was a very important person who everyone wanted to link back to. So now we've made this connection. Again, this was building off of Uncle Rene's research. It was really exciting. Why was I so excited about this? Well, for genealogy researchers, connecting one's ancestry to Metz is like striking gold. And why do I say that? Well, Metz is unique among Jewish communities in Europe for a few reasons. One, it has excellent records. So there are civil records that were maintained. That means birth records, marriage records, death records that extend all the way back to 1717. That's very, very early. It's much earlier than most other places in Europe have civil records. Again, this is many decades before the French Revolution. But there's more than just the civil records where you have a birth, marriage, or death. And we're going to talk about two of them in some detail on the coming slides. One is that there was a memor book, which is a memorial book maintained by the Metz Chevra Kadisha. And it recorded information about community members' deaths going back another century, going back to 1610. So that's pretty amazing. We're going to take a look at some translations of some of these records because they're pretty interesting. And then there also were censuses that enumerated the Jews. And then finally, there are over 1,100 notarial acts from Metz that date back to the 1500s. So that gets into some of the business activity that the Jews were engaging in during that required a notary. So it's extremely rare to have this type of preservation of documentation in any town. What's even better is that there was this French researcher who unfortunately passed away a few years ago named Pascal Faustini, and he combed through all of these documents. And they're in multiple languages. Not all of them are in French. There's also Latin and Old German. So it requires a lot, and synthesis across different communities too, not just in Metz. He'd looked at surrounding communities and places in Germany. And he put together this masterpiece of a book. I'm going to butcher the name, but it's about the community in Metz and the families. And it's really a genealogy book where he talks about the history of Metz and then connects it to all of the genealogies of the families. So I really credit him for doing a lot of the work. I bought this book and have a copy of this book digitally and have read through it and have translated it and read through it. And it's just wonderful to have all this insight. So a lot of the material from this presentation tonight is going to be a synthesis, an English translation of some of the findings that he had. And what I like to tell people, like just taking a step back. So there's a genealogy conference every year that I attended for the first time last summer virtually. And in this presentation, in this conference, there's one session where they have this like contest between two different genealogists. And they basically go back and forth and they try and see how, and there's a panel of judges, they have to prove how far back that they can trace back their ancestry. And, you know, some people, it's like, oh, I can go back to the 1700s. You know, that was basically where people could go back in this contest last summer. And what I tell people is this line is the line I would choose. The Metz ancestry is the line I would choose to compete in this competition. And we would be able to compete with anyone with Jewish ancestry anywhere because the records are so strong. And we'll talk about it. The ancestry goes through Metz, but we actually know quite a bit of the ancestry from these families from before they arrived in Metz too, which makes it pretty amazing. From a genealogical standpoint, this is the best records that I have anywhere in my tree, and it's really exciting to be able to talk about it. So let's begin and talk about the memor book. So what is a memor book? So it means book of remembrance. And, you know, memor bookers, they were maintained in many Jewish communities, particularly in Germany. They can have a lot of different formats, but in Metz, basically what it is a list of the deceased whose memory must be commemorated. The Chevra Kadisha, the Brotherhood of Gravediggers, were responsible for organizing the burials. They would actually write about the deceased person and write things about him. So there are two memory books in Metz. The first one is the one we actually know the most about. It was, again, the death span from 1610 all the way until 1724. And while the list is not exhaustive, we have a lot of different figures of the community are mentioned, but probably more impressive to me is that they're modest people who are mentioned, and men and women are mentioned. Out of the 865, about 20 of our direct ancestors are mentioned in this book. 20, okay? And in the appendix, you can read the English translation of all of their obituaries, basically, that are found in here. So it's fascinating. I highly recommend you check out the appendix section where you can read about some of them. You can read about them. What I would say is the first book, both of them can only be viewed in the Mosul archives. But the first book from 1610 to 1724 was actually translated into French back in 1971. I looked all over the world to find it, but I did find one. Find a copy in Jerusalem that was sent to me. It's in French. It's French translations of the original obituaries that I then translated into English. This book has been amazing, and we're going to talk about some of the obituaries that are found here. But if you want to see a page of what it actually looks like, on the web I was able to find one page of the memory book that's on the right-hand side of the page. And what's pretty amazing is, again, 20 out of 865 are direct ancestors. Guess what? One of our direct ancestors is right here where I'm circling. His name was Alexander ben Natan Cohen. We're actually going to talk about him a little bit in detail. He died in 1703, but you can actually read the Hebrew of his obituary on this digital page. It's the only one that exists online, and lo and behold, one of our ancestors is there. So why is this so important? Well, there are very few memory bookers that have survived intact today, but it provides really valuable information into the people who made up the community, and we can learn about the values of the Metz society. So I sort of synthesized these themes that I saw as I went through the obituaries. So the first one is religious devotion. So that can take on a few different forms. The one that was probably most strange to me, and most strange to modern sensibilities, is fasting. We're going to see one of the obituaries that talk about fasting. Fasting was considered to be very just a sign of religiosity, and people fasted frequently. This was something that was much more common in the medieval era, especially in Ashkenaz lands. And there's definitely been a lot of back and forth on whether that was acceptable in Jewish society over the millennia. But during medieval times, it was very popular, and I've read a lot about it since then. But other ways of showing religiosity is attending morning and evening prayers in the synagogue, studying Torah, shunning materialism, and for women, sewing tzitzit. We see that a few times. So another theme that we see is charitable giving. That was praised highly. And there were a few different places that people gave their tzedakah to. One was to the poor of the community, the poor of Metz. That's the Jewish poor of the community. They also gave money to the poor Jews living in the Holy Land. That's actually mentioned a few times. I don't exactly know how the money was able to get there, but it did. And then to sages in the community. A third theme that I saw was honesty in business matters. That comes up quite a bit, where people who were prominent businessmen, if they were, honest in their business matters, that was something that was described. And then another interesting thing is hospitality towards visitors and members of the community. That is also something that gets highlighted in these books. So that is this first memory book that we have a lot of information on. The second one begins in 1724 and goes until 1849, but those entries have not been translated yet. There's a table that is helpful for genealogies, but we don't actually have the entries. So it's something that hopefully will get digitized and get translated over time, because I'm sure there's a lot of wealth of information there from the 18th century that we don't have as of yet. So that's one.
Where are these kept?
So here, the memory book is kept in the archives in the departmental archives of Moselle. So it's in the region of Metz. It's not in Metz itself, I think. But there's a departmental archives where they're all found. And like on the website that I found here, which you can click and you can get a closer look at the page, you can see this is actually the citation of where it is in the archive. So it actually should be pretty easy to track and to find the originals. But you have to go in person to the archives. Nothing is digitized as of yet. But hopefully it will over time. As I said, having the French translation is huge. The French translation doesn't match the Hebrew translation completely. I was able to like compare to this one entry where I've translated the French, but it's pretty close. There's some phraseology that gets repeated like with every single one that did not get included in the translation, but it's pretty close. But if you look closely, you can actually see Alexander ben Harav Natan HaKohen. You can actually see the name pretty clearly. Okay, so that's one form of documentation that exists, is that member book that we're going to talk about some more. The other one that I mentioned is these Notario Acts. So it's pretty complicated to go through this because the city of Metz was subdivided into several different parishes. And each one had a notary office, which preserved documentation. But there are a lot of different ones. So what Pascal Faustini did is he went through the massive archives. He focused in actually on just a few parishes that tended to have a lot of Jewish activity in the documentation. And he focused there, and he actually categorized all of the documents and every single name that's on the documents. Not only that, he also included signatures of the people who were attesting to these documents. So on the left-hand side of the page, you will see signatures of our direct ancestors. All three of these people are signatures of our direct ancestors. All of them are from the 1600s. First is Natan Cohen, who is the father of Alexander Cohen that we talked about before. Another one here is Berman Zay and Shmuel Trenet here, but also Trenel. So it's pretty amazing to see, a signature of your ancestor from the 1800s. These are going back to the 1600s. You can actually see their handwriting, and you can see some of their signatures are pretty fun. They have like their own character to them, especially with the flourish at the end, which is really, really neat. So what do these acts demonstrate? Well, they show that the Jews were very active in money lending to the Christian community. That's probably not so surprising because that's one of the few professions that were permitted for the Jews. But what is interesting is that it even included rabbis and women in the community who were offering the money lending services. The other really interesting thing from a genealogical perspective is you can also find other family members and find family ties in these documents where, for instance, someone will be writing and will mention, I'm the son-in-law of so-and-so. And so it's very easy to make connections for genealogy using these documents because other family members will be mentioned. So I list here, all of these are notarial acts of our direct ancestors. They're all very interesting. I want to just highlight the first one and the last two just to talk about them because I find them pretty interesting. The first one is from 1607, and it's just a sum of money that's being lent out to a cloth dealer by a man named Isaac. And we actually know that this Isaac is a guy named Isaac Levy, and he was Metz's first rabbi, he's also our direct ancestor of ours, but he was a rabbi who was also doing money lending, and we actually have this document from 1607. And then we're going to fast forward in time to the last two here on the page. The one from 1633 I find is fascinating. So again, these are all our direct ancestors, but there's a miller who lives in another town who is receiving a loan of 75 francs from Samuel Trenet, and he said he will repay it over the course of the next grape harvest with an interest rate of 16%, which is the custom of the Jews. So from a financial guy, it's pretty interesting. We actually know the interest rate that was charged on a loan in the early 1600s, and that people felt that it was adequate compensation to charge an interest rate of 16% over a period of a harvest time period. So that seems like under a year. So pretty interesting to be able to have that sort of information. And then the last one here I love too. It's a woman named Hinlin or Ene. She is attesting to receiving a sum back. I guess basically getting paid back in a certain amount of money, and she signs her name so she knows how to write. And this is a woman who's doing money lending on her own while her husband's alive. So that's pretty interesting. And there are multiple there are multiple notary acts that mention women, but this is one of our direct ancestors. Okay, so now I've talked about some of the sources of information. I want to take a step back and for the next few slides talk about Metz's history and the Jewish refounding of the town, and talk about how the refounding of the town is very much part of our own ancestry, which is pretty incredible. So just the backstory here is that Jews in France were expelled over a period of decades, but the last one took place in 1394, and they moved to German lands. And for a couple hundred years, Jews were not able to live in Metz at all. They might be able to stay for a day or two, but they were not allowed to live permanently in Metz. So the question arises, how did Jews return to Metz? Well, we actually know the story here, and Pascal Faustini was able to uncover it, and it's a fascinating story of how Jews returned. So fast forward now to 1562, and there's basically two people in this story that we want to remember. One is a guy named Isaac. He's living in a nearby town called Marseille. And his son, Isaac's son, whose name was Solomon, he accused another Jew named Abraham. So Isaac and Abraham are the two people you have to remember. Isaac's son said, Abraham, you stole my father's money, a large sum of money. And as a result, the authorities imprisoned Abraham because on this accusation that Abraham had stolen from Isaac. Okay, he was first in this one town for 13 days, and then he was transferred to the Marseille prison for 10 weeks. And while Abraham was in prison, he said, look, I'm innocent, and I'm going to ask for damages from Isaac because he wrongly accused me. I didn't steal his money. And it says that Abraham and he's like, look, I'm a surgeon, I'm a doctor. I'm not able to work right now because I'm in prison right now. So I want to get paid for my lost wages here. So Marseille court system actually issued a favorable verdict for him. And they said, oh, well, actually now, Isaac, you owe money to Abraham for all this false accusation. So Isaac obviously did not like the result of this. Things have turned badly for him. So he appeals to the Bishop of Metz to overturn the ruling. And this is now, again, this started in 1562. Now we're at the May 1563. And basically nothing could be done. And Isaac was told, look, if you're not able to pay these damages that you owe Abraham, we're going to arrest you in Marseille. And just a few days later, they come to arrest him. And lo and behold, these documents are actually written in Latin and Old German, that this is what Pascal had to go through. In 1563, Isaac disappears from Marseille. When he's trying to get arrested, he disappears. So where does he turn up? Well, we find him in the next year, in 1564, he found refuge in the city of Metz and was getting protected there so he wouldn't get arrested. Okay? So he is the first person to return to Metz. And the reason why this whole happened is because he was going to get imprisoned in another town. So from Metz, Isaac continues to fight this verdict. He appeals to a chamber of justice in Speyer, Germany, which was in the Holy Roman Empire. And this case just drags on for years and years. There's a lot of documentation back and forth through the years where they're fighting this out about who owes who. So in the 1570s, from the documents, we find out that this Abraham actually was condemned for other misdeeds, and he was beheaded. Shocking. But Abraham was beheaded. But his heirs are still upset about this, and they continue to fight to get paid for this false accusation. They're like, our father's dead, but we want this money. And then it's actually only after Isaac dies that the families reconcile in 1581. And basically, Isaac's sons pay some money, just a small amount of money, to Abraham's sons, and they say, the lawsuit's over, the lawsuit ends. So this lasted for about 19 years, where they were fighting over this issue, and like really bad blood between these two families, okay? And what the amazing thing is that through Faustini's research, we actually know that this Isaac, the first Jew in Metz to come back, we know his name is Isaac Grotval, and he was a wealthy man originally from Frankfurt. And not only that, he is our direct ancestor. For people of my generation, he was our 12th great-grandfather. For those of my parents' generation, it was their 11th great-grandfather. He was the first Jew back in Metz, and this is the amazing backstory of how he ended up there. So we talked about the first Jew. Well, what was going on at this time in the 1560s where Jews could come back to Metz and find protection? Well, there was a lot going on in the backdrop here. And, prior to this period, the parish priests, who were largely vehemently anti-Semitic and wanted to protect the business interests of the Christians, they were very powerful and they prevented Jews from living in Metz. But around this time, the King of France was a recent territorial acquisition of France, and the King of France was sort of exerting his power, and he had bureaucratic people, governors, who were more aligned with the king than with the parish priests. And why was he interested in having Jews and allowing Jews to be back in the city? Well, he was trying to use Metz as a stronghold, and he built a citadel there in Metz to be sort of a protection, because Metz was on the eastern part of France's territory. And he was building this enormous citadel, but they needed a lot of money to build this out. And guess what? Jews were very helpful with lending money and for providing business opportunities. And so from the political side, the governor and those aligned with the king were very favorable towards Jews, whereas the religious leaders were not. So Jews such as Isaac, which we talked about, they were allowed to temporarily live in the 1560s. But in 1567, it all came to a head, where they were threatened with expulsion. So what you see here actually is an actual letter. It's in French, addressed to the governor of Metz in 1567, and it's addressed by 3 of the 4 Jews who were living in Metz at the time, who were going to be expelled. There were only 4 Jews. Their names were Isaac, Gershon, Mordechai, and Michel. That's Michael. We actually know, and they basically appealed to the governor, and the governor overruled the merchants of Metz, and they allowed those 4 Jews, to reside permanently. They had to pay a large fee and an annual fee to the city, but they were allowed to reside in Metz permanently and were given protection. So 1567 is really the first year where Jews were allowed to live there permanently. And so through the research, again, we actually know the identities of all 4 of these people. And like with Isaac, who we already know, 2 of the other 3 people who were the first Jews to settle in Metz were our direct ancestors. Gershon was this guy named Gershon Zeh, and Mordechai Cohen was actually the brother of the infamous Abraham that we talked about. He was a doctor, and just like Abraham was as well. So 3 out of the 4 first Jews to settle in Metz were our direct ancestors. So then, going from those 4 people, the community grew. So in 1574, King Henry III actually authorized 8 households to live in the city. It increased to 19 in 1595, and then 24 in 1603. And they're mentioned that they are all descendants of the first 8 households. So that really helps when you're building genealogies to know that they're all connected to these 8 families and just these 8 households at the beginning. And I talked about this first rabbi, Isaac Levy. He is my 13th great-grandfather, and he was the rabbi for 25 years, from 1595 into 1620. And he served as the first rabbi of the community. So I'm going to go through this next slide rather quickly, and we're going to talk about just where did the Jews settle. And there's this beautiful map here from the 1500s of the city of Metz, And starting in 1575, they began to live in this area right here that I'm circling. It's just south of the river, just bordered by the ramparts here. This ended up becoming the Jewish quarter of Metz. It's called the Saint Foy district, and it grew over time. It was not a ghetto like other cities in Europe, which you would see in Venice, Rome, or Prague. There was no chain, nothing was closed off or anything, but it was just that's where the Jews were allowed to live and where Jews lived. And there was even a street called the Rue de Juif, or the Street of the Jews. And what's also important too is that starting in 1614, Jews were actually allowed to buy houses and not just rent in the city. And we actually know, based off of censuses, that in 1632, Jews owned 60 houses, and in 1678, they owned 100 houses, all in this area here. It ended up becoming much more built out than you see here in the 1500s. All right. This next slide here, again, part of the history of Metz that I thought it was pretty important to talk about. We all talk about the Black Plague in the 1300s, in the mid-14th century, that decimated European population. Anywhere between 30% to 50% of all of European people died in that plague. Well, the bubonic plague did not just go away. It recurred at various times afterwards and caused a lot of death. Obviously not as much as what took place in the 1300s. And we actually have a lot of information about what took place in 1636 in Metz. So, in the beginning here, I talk about how the families grew from the 1610s all the way until the 1630s. But you see a big drop-off in the population by 1643. So what happened? Well, in October 1635, this is some history here. So between 1618 and 1648, there was the 30 Years' War, which largely took place in Germany. In the first 17 years, much of the fighting was in the Holy Roman Empire in Germany. Well, what took place in 1635? France got involved in the war, and they sent their troops over to fight in Germany because and they were brought in. Well, guess what? These soldiers who were stationed in Metz, they brought plague and fever and dysentery to the population as they were quartered in Metz starting in the fall of 1635. And we actually know that there was an earlier epidemic of the plague back in 1625 that claimed 3,000 people in Metz. Well, it reappeared in 1635 and peaked in 1636. And it's interesting, we actually know that the city took precautionary measures. They cleaned the streets. They isolated patients. They closed off infected houses, okay? So they knew some practices from the last couple centuries of dealing with it, of how to do that. But it still did not prevent a lot of people from getting the bubonic plague. And there's actually a discussion about bodies being cast into the river. And they even have a description of one Metz resident who said it was the most deadly and disastrous of modern times in our country. So the Metz Member Book has 14 entries from that year. But Faustini actually found a record in the Metz archives that has over 4,000 deaths in just a 11-month time period in 1636. And among those are 75 Jews and the closing of 15 Jewish houses where there were infections. And none of our direct ancestors that I know of died according to those 75, but there were many within our families that did die, particularly the Zay family. And so you can actually see a section of this document that lists the deaths here on the left-hand side. This is from January and February. Another dark moment in Metz history that I wanted to touch upon was the trial of Raphael Levy. Probably most of you have never heard about this, but it was a very big event in the 17th century. And there was actually, I'll talk about it, a recent book that came out that talks about it. So what happened about Raphael Levy? So the story is, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, this man named Raphael Levy, who was a cattle dealer, he actually didn't live in Metz. There's a lot of documents actually from him from the 1640s and 1650s doing some transactions in Metz with cattle and dealing with cattle, but he didn't live there. He lived in another town, a rural town called Boulay, which was east of Metz. He was accused of kidnapping and murdering a 3-year-old Christian child. So he was seen walking through this little town of Glatany, And what had Raphael had been? He had gone to Metz. He was going to purchase wine and a shofar for Rosh Hashanah. This is literally right before Rosh Hashanah. He was going to the town that was close by to make some purchases. He was seen walking through the town where the child was last seen. Okay, this 3-year-old child. A few weeks later, they find a corpse of a child that obviously couldn't identify, who had been devoured by beasts. It was heavily mutilated, and an accusation was raised against Raphael by the family of the deceased child. And it was the first blood libel in over a century. In fact, this is not something that you would typically see in France in the 1600s at all. They were trying to see more modern. They tried to treat Jews more, fairly. Obviously, they were not citizens, and they had to pay heavy taxes, but there were no such accusations elsewhere in France at this time. And so what happened to Raphael? Well, he was in prison in Metz. He suffered torture, and he defended himself and maintained his innocence throughout the trial. The trial was basically a sham trial where there were people from his town that came to actually support him. They were denied, basically, entry into the court and into the court of law. And he was found guilty. And so the Jewish community interceded on his behalf in Metz. And the Holy Roman Emperor, and a representative of the King of France, they both tried to intervene, but it was too late at the time. Basically, the Parliament of Metz just wanted to do whatever they wanted to, and they burned him at the stake. So it's a really, really sad tale of blood libel. And even though this Raphael Levy, he was not a direct ancestor of ours, his descendants, so his wife and children after he died, moved to Metz, and his descendants married into our Cohen family that we'll talk about. And his descendants ended up being, cousins of ours. So he is definitely connected to our family. I include some links here where you can learn about the trial. There's a wonderful book that came out that I've read a book review of. I have not purchased it, but it's a English translation of a book that was written in French by a professor. The book just came out in the last decade that talks about the ritual murder. And as a result of all of this attention coming about this incident in recent years, he was exonerated by the community in France and by the whole community. He has a street named for him, I think, in Metz now. And there were all these articles in 2014 about his exoneration because it was very clearly a sham trial where he was clearly not guilty of the charge. But interesting that this took place in Metz. In fact, the author of this book links this to events in the 19th century with the Alfred Dreyfus trial, and it had similar ramifications where how French grappled with Jews in their society. All right, so we talked about the history of Metz in up into the 17th century. I want to bring it back a little bit closer to home with our family and some of the research that I did, synthesizing Pascal Faustini's research. So, where did people come from when they came to Metz? So, it was actually difficult to come and move into Metz. You had to pay heavy taxes. And so typically the people who would arrive into Metz and come into the community, they were wealthy. They had to be pretty wealthy. As I said, Faustini did a lot of great work where he charted where these families came from. So what I did is I put together this chart here of all of the different... Now, I did not highlight this earlier, but all of these families had surnames from when they came to Metz. That is super rare. Most people in Ashkenaz Ancestry adopted surnames between 1750 and the early 1800s, and it's very hard to trace ancestry from before then because people were just using patronyms. That's not the case here in Metz. People actually used surnames because it was a large enough city that people, to distinguish themselves, they used surnames in the town. And so we can actually trace these surnames to specific towns elsewhere in Europe. So what I do here is just list the different surnames. There were a few different Cohen families that we descend from. The Cohen number 2 is probably the most interesting because that's the one that Flora descends from on her paternal line. But I actually list where they're first mentioned in the Metz records, anywhere from the 1500s to the 1700s. Then they also list the name of this first Metz resident and how they are, how I descend from them and what my connection is to them. All of these people who are mentioned here are in the appendix. I have all this great family tree where you can find all these people and see exactly how they're connected to Flora. So what I've done on this next slide here is show a geographic representation of where these people were. Maybe I'll just go back a slide for a moment. What you see here, and I'll highlight here, is that two of these families, actually, one is more a guess, it's not with certainty, but one is with certainty, actually can trace their roots to Spain and to Sephardi Spain during the 15th century. This is something that people may not realize, is that there were Jews who were expelled from Spain during the Inquisition that came to Ashkenaz land. Some went to like the Netherlands, where there was a large Sephardic community, but then others migrated into other parts of Europe, and they assimilated into the Ashkenazi culture. But I listened to a fascinating podcast a couple of months ago that talked about DNA from Jews in Western Europe versus Jews who have more Eastern Europe. So when it comes to Flora Cohen, all of her direct ancestors are from Western Europe. It's almost certain that none of them were in Poland or places further east during her ancestry. And for people who had that type of ancestry, where it's known that they were from France or Western Germany throughout their whole ancestry, their DNA looks actually pretty interesting in the sense that they sort of are in between the Jews of Sephardi lands and the Jews of Eastern European lands. They're pretty distinct, and they're sort of in between. They're actually as close to Sephardi in their ancestry as they are to the Eastern Jews, the Eastern Ashkenazi Jews, which is fascinating, that they're as distant to the Eastern Ashkenazi Jews as they are to the Sephardi Jews. And part of the reason for that is there actually is a lot of Sephardi connections that got into the DNA pool, into the Western European land that was more prominent and stayed. And so we actually see that in our own ancestry. We actually can trace to Sephardi lands on at least two of the lines here, which is pretty neat. So I just show here a map of, through the centuries, the 1500s, the 1600s, and the 1700s, where our families were from beforehand. So you can see in the 1500s they came from close by, outside of Metz, just east of there, or Germany, or the Netherlands. In the 1600s, it was prominent, mainly from Germany. There was a family from Zurich, and then in the 1700s, it was all from Alsace. That's where families came from. I want to go back just for a moment to this slide here and talk about the earlier ancestry from these towns. I talked about Spain. Well, some of these families were very famous families that we can trace back, going back well beyond the 1500s. So I'll just give a couple examples here. The Oppenheim family, that was from Worms in Frankfurt, we can go back to the 1400s very easily on several of those lines. And we have lots of documentation in Frankfurt and Worms from this family. The Guggenheim family, that was originally from, right before coming to Metz, they were from a town in Switzerland, but beforehand they were from Western Germany. We can trace the Guggenheim line back to the 1300s, okay? And then the very first here at the top here, the Grotval Trenel, the first Jew in Metz, Isaac Grotval. So we can trace his ancestry. Again, Frankfurt has a lot of great records. We can trace his ancestry on many lines to the 1400s, on several lines to the 1300s, and even one line to the 1200s, okay? Pretty amazing. These are no rabbis. There aren't any famous rabbis in this line, okay? This is just people who live their lives, and we have records from them. It's pretty amazing. And it's very hard to trace anyone's ancestry from before the Black Plague. And here, we can go back several generations beforehand. This is the late 1200s. So it's really remarkable. And to have so much ancestry, it really is incredible. All right. These last few slides here, I'm going to talk about some of our direct ancestors. This one is, I really wanted to talk about the Cohen family, which is Flora's direct paternal line. So what you see here on the top left are the signatures of 3 successive generations of our ancestors. Ori Cohen, Ori David, he was the first person to come to Metz in the early 17th century, in the early 1600s. And we know that Ori was very wealthy. He had a huge home in 1632 on that census. We actually have his house number and exactly what street he lived on. And he had 5 rooms, a kitchen, a stove, and a stable for 40 horses. Okay, this guy was described as being at the highest social stratum of the Metz community. So even in the early 1600s, this early arrival to Metz and our ancestor was very wealthy. And that's sort of the tagline for the Cohen family, is that they were a very wealthy family. So the son, Natan, which you can read on the top left here, this is his signature. You can see all of them did a really interesting signature wave. They had their own little thing that they did with the Nun Sofit at the end. He's described in the Memor book as fasting. So I included the translation here. For 40 years, he mortified himself by fasting, and for more than 20 years, he would fast from one Sabbath to another. So that means that from every day for 20 years that was not Shabbat, he would fast. It's unclear whether it was both food and drink or just food, but he would do that and would display that prominently to the community, that they would know that during the daytime he would be fasting. Again, this is not something that you would see in modern times, but it's something that was viewed as a sign of religiosity back then. And then we go to Natan's son Senderlin, who, this is the one that you can actually see his obituary in the actual Hebrew on a previous slide. So here he's described as being very charitable and giving, donating to the poor and to the Holy Land. And then we even get a fourth generation, who is Solomon Moshe Cohen, and he was a very wealthy banker. And you can see by his obituary that I include the whole translation here. He was extremely charitable, and he was a leader of the community, but he was also talks about his charitable things. He gave a lot of money to the poor, to the sages, to the community, and even when he was sick on his deathbed, he contributed a lot of money, and there was a lot of money that was distributed after his death, between his death and his burial. All of this is described in the Memor book. It's one of the longest entries for anyone, and it was a sign of his great wealth. The last thing that I'll say about this slide, again, these are all our direct ancestors, but they also happen to be the direct ancestors of another famous person who I like to talk about sometimes, and that is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, famous from Seinfeld. She is a direct descendant of all these individuals and is our cousin. And in the appendix, you can see exactly how she descends from him, which is pretty neat. But she is my ninth cousin and ninth cousin once removed. If you want to know the specifics on the Metz side, there's also some connections through Alsace where she's an even closer connection at an eighth cousin once removed. But it is pretty cool to see that there are other people, famous people who descend from these well-known people in Metz. Okay, but when we talk about famous people in Metz, from Metz, I think no one gets eclipsed than Moshe Blin, who I was pretty shocked to find is a direct ancestor of ours, and he only lived the end of his life in Metz, but I include him in this presentation because he did live in Metz for a few years at the end of his life. But who was this Moshe Blin? Why was he so famous? Well, he was born in Alsace in around 1700. He's my seventh great-grandfather, and he became extremely wealthy by supplying the king's armies with horse and food. This is also like feed for the horses as well. And he was stationed in Alsace, and basically he was the right-hand man for the secretaries for the state of war for about 35 years, between 1720 and 1757. He became very close with a specific count, who was the Secretary of War from between 1743 and 1757. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. He was the most powerful Jew in Alsace while he was alive. He was also one of its wealthiest. Okay? The other really interesting thing about this guy, Moshe Blin, is his another claim to fame that I thought was interesting is he was actually the first Jew who had the right to settle in the city of Strasbourg, which is a big city in Alsace that did not let Jews live there. Once France regained the control of the city in the 1690s, they prohibited Jews from living there. But because he was so influential and wealthy, he was allowed to live there for just him, no other Jews. He was allowed to live and settle there for a number of years. And he sort of paved the way because a few decades later, another famous merchant and philanthropist, who you may have heard of, Hertz Surfbear of Meddelsheim, he would become the first Jew to permanently settle in Strasbourg. And he led to the restrictions being lifted, which happened right after the French Revolution, when Jews were allowed to live in Strasbourg more widely. But Moshe Blin was the first one. He was the first one who was allowed to settle there, which is pretty cool. He also held the title of the Deputy General of the Jewish Nation in Alsace. He basically oversaw a management board for the Jewish community in Alsace, and it included a couple other very influential people, Aaron Meyer and Jacob Baruch Wheel. And Jacob Baruch Wheel is also an ancestor of ours, and that gets into something because these three sort of were extremely wealthy. They had a lot of established business links, and they importantly connected their families through marriage too. So a descendant of the Whale family and the Blint family married each other, and that's why they are our direct ancestors, both of them. In 1756, this is towards the end of his life, Moishe settled in Metz, and he became the head of the community until his death in 1762. And he gave a lot of money to charity, and this amount, this 25,000 livres, that was an extraordinarily high amount of money that he donated to the poor children of the community, and he was a leading patron of Jewish education in Metz. So this, on the right-hand side here, you actually see this is the ark curtain that was used in the synagogue of Metz. You can read the Hebrew. It was donated by Moshe Blin and his wife Malka. And what I have, I'm going to skip very quickly to an appendix section. I could not include it in the main section, but since we're on Moshe Blin, I'm going to go there very quickly to this page here, where he actually had a seal that he used to stamp envelopes. You can actually see what it looks like. And what's notable about it is he uses coats of arms and a crown that signaled chivalry and nobility, and got away with it. Basically, that was not something that only people who were from nobility were really technically allowed to use these types of seals on, but he was able to do it. And the French society basically and the monarchy allowed him to do that. And he saw himself as a nobleman. And pretty amazing that we actually have a picture of it. And I have an explanation of it, but you can see his letters in English or in French and his Hebrew name, Moshe Blin. And then you can see how decorative the ark curtain is. A much bigger picture of it, just that's less, that you can see that it was very ornate. So it was pretty amazing to find that we directly descend from him. And then the last slide here that I have is Flora's father. So Moshe Blin was Flora's great-grandfather. Now we're at Flora's father, Simon Shimon Cohen. So he is the one who's mentioned in all these graves that we find in Alsace. So who was he? He was born in Metz. We have his birth record from Metz. And he, as I said, the rabbis in Metz were all sourced outside of the Metz community. So if you wanted to be a rabbi and you were from Metz, you had to go to Alsace and go to some of these rural towns where you became a rabbi there, because you would not become a rabbi in Metz. That was not sort of a future profession. So he started out in a few different towns. He ended up in Hagenau between 1811 and 1825. He was in a different town at the 1808 census. When the names were changed and the surnames were adopted in 1808, which you'll see, he was in another town called Saussure. But he moved in 1811 to Hagenau, and then in 1826, he was appointed as the chief rabbi of southern Alsace, which the head city, the regional capital there, was Colmar. And he was sworn in March of 1826, and he served there until 1833. He was the first chief rabbi of southern Alsace to receive a salary from the state, which was pretty impressive, starting in 1831. And I have in the appendix, I've talked about this in the past, he addressed political events in his speeches. And if you read his sermons, they read so modern today. I mean, he's connecting what he sees in the world today and being a citizen of France to his Jewishness. And we see this all the time today in the modern world. And like having traced our ancestry on other lines where our family, like for instance, our rabbinic line, you look at what was written in the 1830s and it's much more rabbinic and less connected to the modern world than our ancestor Simon Cohen. So I have a speech that was translated, a sermon that was translated in the appendix, which you can read as well, in which I have included on a prior presentation. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I'll just say on the appendix slides here, you can see all of the linkages to all of the different people who I mentioned here, and you can walk through them through these different slides. There are a few slides of that, and then you can read through all of the excerpts of our direct ancestors in the memo book, and you can read about them here that I translated into English. And then there's just some additional information in the back. So with that, I'm going to, I think, stop sharing my screen. I'm going to, let me see if I can stop the screen share.